Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Mindfuel, where we're making mental fitness accessible to endurance athletes so you can train your brain as consciously as you train your body. Today, we are again diving into visualization, specifically how to get started with it, specific tool recommendations for tackling this, and how you can work with a coach to hone the skill. So joining us for this discussion today is Philip Hatzis. Philip, welcome to Mindfuel.
Hello, how are you?
Great. I'm so happy to have you here. And I could get started immediately saying why, but first, as always, we will let you introduce yourself. And Philip, we start every episode at Mindfuel by asking our guests to tell us not what they do, but explaining who they are. So how would a friend or a partner or a family member describe you?
Well, hopefully my children would affectionately call me Daddy. So I've got two children and I am an incredibly, I think, loyal and generally hardworking type of person. I guess that lends itself to endurance sports quite nicely because you like to kind of keep working hard. But yeah, so I guess I'm someone who's always active, always an extrovert, and wanting to be the last person standing at a party as well, which is a big part of
a different kind of endurance.
Bit of a different type of endurance, absolutely. Yeah, always someone who's keen to try and have fun in whatever we apply ourselves to.
Nice. Love that. Well, hopefully we can bring that good energy into the conversation today. Can you also tell us a little bit more about your relationship to sport? And I actually want to ask you this on a couple of dimensions. First, yourself as an athlete and how that's come to fruition in your life.
Sure. So I was somebody who always loved doing active stuff, be that playing outside with my brothers, fighting outside with my brothers, or generally just pursuing different sports. And I recall I was probably about 13, 14. My dad said, "Look, Phil, you do a whole bunch of different sports, from tennis to rugby to running, golf, you name it, judo." I was doing lots. He said, at some point, you're going to have to start sort of specializing a little bit more to be a little bit more specific to some type of sport. So I kind of thought about it for a while and found triathlon, which was obviously three sports, so not specializing whatsoever. And I kind of came to that from a rugby / cross country running background. I realized that in cross country, as the races got longer, I got more competitive and started being a little bit more competitive over sort of 10Ks and half marathons. And then my cross country coach at the time said to me, "Do I fancy doing an Ironman?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. What is it?" And I should have asked.
Always yes first.
Yeah, I should have asked a different question first. But I then ended up signing up for my first Ironman the year after I left school. Loved it. Loved multi-sport training. And that led me into sort of pursuing that competitively as an age grouper, and then ended up in the career which I'm in now.
Fantastic. Did you stay focused on long course triathlon, or did you, as an age grouper, come back to short course?
Oh, I loved long distance. Like that was always where I was very happy. I love the training. I love the totally nuts nature of just going for a long run or long ride or whatever it might be. And I guess those partly bragging rights, isn't there, when you kind of say, "Oh, what have you done this morning?" It's I've done a half marathon kind of thing before breakfast. But no, I just like doing the longer distance racing and training more than the racing. And it got you to some pretty cool places around the world as well. So you could do some nice traveling at the same time.
Very cool. Well, I tend to think the topic we'll be talking about today is particularly important in those very long races where you have a lot of time in your own head and with yourself. So really looking forward to hearing more about your tactics for tackling that. You alluded to this, but the other dimension of your relationship with sport is professional now. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you've folded that into your life?
Absolutely. So whilst at university, I started doing my coaching qualifications within triathlon, and I actually set up a company, Try Training Harder, with a few university friends, where we started off coming out to Portugal for training camps. And we realized after a couple of iterations of them that, first of all, the USP of going out to a nice location wasn't particularly USP orientated, because a bunch of students did that and we were those students. So any other bunch of students could do exactly the same thing. But we also recognized that people kept on coming back, not because of the location, although that was a perk, but also because of the coaching and the approaches that we were taking. And that's when we sort of pivoted slightly and focused a lot more on our coaching part of the business. Fast forward about 16 years now. We have coaches all around Europe. We've got one in the Middle East now as well. And we've put a lot of work into our coach development platform as well. So we have an onboarding process to ensure that we have all our coaches working to a professional standard. And yeah, so I find myself now coaching athletes, coaching coaches, and being very much immersed within the sport at various different levels in terms of the industry and also the governance as well.
Truly an expert. So we're really grateful to have you here and to learn from you today. And before we get into the visualization topic, I wanted to actually take a step back and talk a little bit about mental training in general. So, Philip, you were very generous with your time as I was working through the idea for this concept of Mindfuel. And your thoughts and feedback on what athletes might need and what might be reasonable to fit into their training has been hugely helpful to shaping this. So, first of all, thank you very much for that. But also, it showed me what expertise you have in this area. And you also expressed such a passion for it that I'm really glad to have you here today to just talk a little bit more in general about why you believed in the power of what we're trying to achieve at Mindfuel. So with that said, can you just tell me a little bit more why you think mental training is so important and what from your own experience, obviously we've heard you have a depth of your own athletic experience, but then also as a coach and running this large organization and network of athletes and coaches, what signals are you getting from that audience that made you tell me the mental side is really important?
Okay, so I'm going to answer a few of those things in sequence. So I think the first thing which I would sort of iterate, and we briefly touched upon it a couple of times in conversations outside of this call, is that for me, a good coach or a coach who's really working with the athlete is trying to work outside what they've done in their own athletic experiences. So we spoke about, remember, Phil, to talk about your own experience as an athlete, but actually I find that quite a narrow bandwidth as a coach, because if I recall my own athletic approaches, then anyone who is like me would resonate really well. But it doesn't provide a particular generic or generalized approach to coaching, which can be applied to different athletes because every single person is different. So a really good example of that is if you have, a top level age group that goes into coaching or professional athlete goes into coaching. If you're like that person and they coach in the same way as they train, then, that coach would be perfect for you. But if that coach hasn't explored why certain things are happening to understand the reasoning that it resonated for them, it's going to be very difficult for them to help coach the individual. So I'll try and stay more in that sort of what works for people rather than what works for me. In general, athletes are, really focus on what they can do, and Strava is out there, whatever it might be, what other versions you're using to track what you're doing, how many miles you've done. I even mentioned it myself, running before meeting up with others, having done a half marathon was a mini bragging right. And I think that with athletes, that a lot of the time these visible physical things that we can do, the attributes that might even include body composition, it might include how far you can run, how fast you can do a race time, and it doesn't matter. All those things are parts of their ego and their identity. And when you start looking into anything to do with the performance psychology side of things, a lot of the time you have to start addressing some pretty big questions around that. And that's where often athletes don't want to be shouting about it and bragging about it until they've made a really big U-turn. So because of that, I think a lot of the time mental strength, the performance psychology side of things, is not addressed or picked up on properly. There is definitely a push now generally for better mental health, and you've had some very high profile athletes remove themselves from competition due to, quote, mental health reasons. Not always going into specific details about it, but that is starting to become more of a really important conversation. But still, I think that athletes don't necessarily understand where that fits in. And when I look at athletes, Maslow's hierarchy of needs is fantastic. And you've got this nice pyramid of things you can do once you've done certain things. So you're looking at basic stuff like shelter, finding food. And from a modern day athlete, that still exists. Have I got the money to pay the mortgage? Am I able to pay the bills and that side of things at a very basic level? So when you're looking at an athlete and the performance side of things, they're never going to be able to perform at the top of their ability if they don't have some really basic psychological safety, which they're working within. add on to that, most people, when you start looking into sports psychology, you're starting to think about the things which I think you're covering on your website really well. So visualization is the obvious one. Imagery, similar sort of thing. Mindfulness might come out as well. But those things are totally meaningless if they're built upon a foundation which doesn't have really good quality psychological safety already. When we're looking into sports psychology with athletes, we're looking into the psychology of the human. Like, are they in a really good place to be able to do the training they need to? Are they able to put in the performance skills they need, which are psychological? And often that is not stuff that people talk about because it's either a given or it's stuff that actually really is quite hard to talk about. Like, if you sit there and say, I don't feel psychologically safe for whatever reason, maybe work's difficult, relationships are going hard as well, those things don't really allow you to perform. So you're going to always be distracted. And so I think that, if I look at psychology in that global way, which is kind of where your question was going to initially, and we've definitely sidetracked a few times, it's very much around yes, performance psychology is important. And I think that the difference between sport winners and sport losers, and that might just be second place instead of first place, is rarely to do with how they physically train, but almost always to do with how they've set themselves up for their training. And there's a psychological difference between the two of them. But it's a very difficult thing to do unless you're looking at some of the basics already.
That makes a lot of sense. I think I would add one thing and then also ask a follow-up question. What I would add is I think we're not well, in general, coached on how to talk necessarily about psychological safety, I would say. And some of what you mentioned, I don't know that we always, as humans, have the words or the awareness, or the ability to articulate what some of those feelings are or even identify them. And a huge push in the last years on that in general, and particularly in certain Western cultures. But that's something that I do think is challenging, which leads me to part of my next question, which is, how do you work with coaches to help ask questions or get athletes to articulate that?
So there's two parts to that question. The first bit is, how do you help coaches ask questions? And the second part looks into, how do you build that rapport with the athlete? Asking questions is the skill. And there's certain people do it better than others, but it's also a kind of a core part of coaching. If we go swimming, you go for a swim session together, how does that feel? Immediately got a question straight out there. What did you find work for you? There's so many ways of asking questions to get to an area of understanding. So, being able to ask questions is really important for coaches. And we spent a lot of time in our coach development just looking into how that's done, but also building the rapport within that helps you ask more powerful questions. We've had 3 or 4 conversations. We have some mutual contacts. So I've got a little bit more of a rapport with you than somebody, we just bump into each other in the street or in the coffee shop or anything like that. So I will, I'll be able to ask you a little bit more of a deeper question, but I won't sort of be able to sit there and go, how's your marriage going? Or, anything really deep and meaningful, or what's your relationship like with your mother? Anything like that, which goes into a very different level. It would probably be more like, what are you doing later on for the weekend? So it would be that level of conversation. Sure. Being able to ask those hard questions with athletes means you do have to put the groundwork in beforehand to get to know them, to get to know the tells, which are both physical and psychological, to know when the right time is to be able to ask the questions as well. And as you get to know the athlete better, you are going to be able to do a better job of asking that same question, which is one of the reasons why, I've got no qualms whatsoever about sharing the side of things that we do. You can just come and watch me coach an athlete, because if you stood in front of the same athlete at the same time and asked the same question, you would get a very different response, because all the ways that I have known the athlete, the non-verbal communication that goes on, along with the history and the experience, it will be a different way. The athlete will respond differently. So there's a lot of work which goes into that relationship in order to be able to ask the big questions. And sometimes that time, it's not right. It's not right to ask about how someone's divorce is going, or where they think they're going to be in 10 years' time, or why do they think they did so badly in that race, or even telling them the truth, the real truth at that point in time. They might think, it's because I wasn't able to run fast enough. And actually, the honest part of it might be, well, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's because of how you have been training in the previous few months, but that's as a result of something else. So we need to peel back the layers to get to the point where we can ask that. So it's all about understanding and relationships, and really getting to know the person to be able to start having those conversations. And that's tricky, but it's also a joy. That's part of the enjoyment of working with people.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time. And I think one of the topics that comes up in every one of these conversations at Mindfuel is that ideally we're all here as athletes for the journey and less so for the destination. And I think that's then also true in our coaching relationships, that we need to be patient and let that journey develop as well. Obviously, if it doesn't feel right or we're not getting comfortable as athletes with the coach, then maybe we move on. But hiring a new coach, it takes time to get there.
Absolutely. The real art of coaching has nothing to do with what you're doing on terms of the bike. It's like why you're doing it. It's the psychology piece of it, how biomechanics, those parts there, that how you communicate that is where coaching is really powerful. Otherwise, it's just a training plan, which you can kind of download for free nowadays anyway, or
True.
ask ChatGPT for
Hello,
one as well.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's go ahead and pivot to today's topic du jour, which, as we said, is visualization. And I'm really excited about this because I think sometimes mental training can be a little bit theoretical, but I think visualization is probably one of the most practical tools that can be applied fairly rapidly, and probably you can see results from pretty quickly. And so to get started with that today, can you just give us your own kind of definition or way of thinking about what is visualization?
So visualization is a psychological construct. So it's a thing psychologically where we either do it internally or externally, where we imagine something at a very loose level. So if we're looking at internal visualization, we are doing it. So I am imagining myself going for a run, hitting a tennis shot, playing a golf swing, it doesn't matter. And there's some really powerful examples and experiments where if I imagine me hitting a tennis shot, you actually see in the EMG and the brain scans, you can see those light up showing exactly this, not anywhere near the same strength as actually going for a run or anything like that, but you can see the same patterns happening within the brain. So there is a physical and a psychological connection there. And then there's external visualization where you watch somebody else do that and then you think, well, maybe I can do that. So the 4-minute mile is a great example of that. Once one person did it, suddenly lots of other people were able to do it as well. So as soon as you start seeing something happening, it's doable. The key thing to remember with visualization or imagery is that there's internal and external, but it can be done positively or negatively. So if you think about something like golf, for example, don't hit it into the bunker, don't hit it into the water. And then the first thing you do, you hit it into the bunker. If you're cycling, don't hit the pothole, avoid the pothole. You look at the pothole, you go into the potholes. Visualization can be positive and negative. I can't remember exactly what the stat was, but essentially a negative image is significantly more powerful than a positive one. So if you start having self-doubt about something, be that hitting a shot into the bunker or hitting a pothole, or I won't be able to do this, I'm no good, you're going to have a much stronger response than if you start giving yourself a self-talk, the positive side of things as well, which is much more positive.
That's really interesting. And I think one of the classic examples in sport of visualization, I think, comes from Michael Phelps, who talks about how he used to think about all the things that could go wrong. So exactly what you're saying. But I guess he then flipped it and said, so how am I going to respond and how am I going to make that not a problem? And so kind of put that positive in. So goggles filled with water, which actually happened in one of his Olympic races. It's on our website if you want to read more about that and how he handled it. But he knew then he would count his strokes. So I guess just to round out or kind of ask in terms of what you're saying, the negative is sometimes important to acknowledge that it can happen, but then it's most powerful if we can flip it to then what are we going to do in that situation to make it mitigate the challenge as best as possible.
Yeah, I think that comes under race planning. So you've got race planning and you've got what if scenarios. So what if I have a puncture? I'm racing a triathlon. What if I have a puncture? Well, let's break that down a bit further. Can I ride with that on the flat tire? Some of the newer type options of wheels you can, so that's not a problem. And some of the older type ones you can't, so you have to stop. Can I change a tire? No. Well, in that case, your race is going to be over, or you have to wait for a support vehicle. So those, I would try and reframe those into actions on or what if scenarios where you're really working with an athlete to try and make sure they actually have the skills to be able to do that. So in terms of the goggles filling up with the water, can you count lengths? Yeah, okay, fine. Well, then we'll make sure we'll count lengths all the time. And then if they fill up with water, you just count lengths. So it's about making sure that you are actually covering off all the bases. And that gives that athlete confidence that even if that happens, there is still a route towards their success, what they're trying to do, their goal. So it's important, yes, to acknowledge it. But I think that's probably more in the kind of the what if scenarios. The other thing to think about is when something gets too big. So, I've got this image, I'm going to go to a world championship event, or I'm going to do my first ever triathlon, my first ever 5 kilometer park run. It doesn't matter. You suddenly have this big goal and it's this huge mountain in front of you. Or reframing can be really helpful in terms of trying to break that goal down. We're going into the weeds a little bit in terms of imagery, but you can sit there and sort of say, okay, well, for me to go and do my first ever 5K, that is a big deal for a lot of people. What do you need to be able to do on the day? Let's just work through that day. Let's go right back to the very beginning. So you're going to wake up. Can you wake up, Laura? Yes, you can wake up. Okay, fine. So what do you need to do once you've done that? Have breakfast. What are you going to have for your breakfast? What do you need to do to make that easy? Okay, so we know that you can do that. Okay, visualize what it looks like in terms of getting dressed. You need to go to the toilet, then go. You can go there. Okay, well, can you tie your shoelaces? Yes. And you start breaking all these things into very small imagery chunks, which an athlete is always going to be able to do. Like, of course you can, you're an adult woman, you can tie your shoelaces or at least put your shoes on, kind of thing. And you just keep on breaking that down, and you start getting to the race side of things, and it's okay, well, you've done your warm up, you visualize through chunks each of those different bits, and can you take one step forward on your run? Yes, okay. How do you know if you're going to go I'm going to go too fast? Well, I'm not going to go too fast. How do you know? I'll look at my pace clock. Okay, can you look at your watch? Yes, I can. Make sure you don't forget it. Okay, we put that down on our list of things to take with us to the bag. So you can break those things down and in a visual way, which makes the athlete go through that motion. So that's internal visualization, which makes them realize that they can do it. It might be that you have a friend, a sister, it doesn't matter, somebody who's done a 5K. And well, I know that Laura's done it, so I can do a 5K. And that helps you with that external visualization. And again, so, well, what did they do? Well, they did this. Okay, so I might try and do that. So again, visualization can be used about breaking down what seems like the impossible goal to be able to make it suddenly a little bit more possible in a couple of different ways as well.
And is this something that you and your coaches always incorporate into your work with athletes? Or do you sort of know that there's a specific time in terms of their own maturation or in advance of a race or something, and you wait for that, or do you wait for the athlete to ask?
No, but yes. I think that when you look at endurance sports, it's a bit different. So a golfer, for example, they can go through a visualization process. In fact, there's a great example, and I couldn't find it to kind of quote the research, but I think it was a guy who was a POW in Vietnam. And the way he got through his captivity was he imagined playing a round of golf on his favorite home golf course. So he was away for however many months or years, and he came back, haven't played golf for ages, picked up his golf clubs, went out and played that round of golf. And because he had visualized it so much, he played like a perfect round of golf, almost exactly the way that he wanted to. So, when you look at visualization in those types of sports where you can really think about the movement of one stroke at a time, it's much easier to be able to have visualization as a really core tool, because especially with golf, you walk between each shot. Tennis, you stand up, you take a serve, you've got those pre-shot routines, as they're often recognized, which are almost dialing you in to turn off your conscious mind to make things more subconscious. So you just go and swing the ball, you don't overthink it. Whereas endurance sports isn't quite the same. You've got the same repetitive actions: swimming, one arm, then the other arm, running the same, but with legs, cycling similarly. All those different things exist from an endurance, like a visualization piece. But endurance, you're doing 90 strides, one left leg light strides a minute, 90 cadence on the bike. There's 150 to 220 odd foot strikes or pedal strokes or swimming strokes being about 1 a second. There's a lot of them when you start going into long distance racing. So a lot of the time, imagery in these sort of sports is actually more focused around cues or technical focus points.
Okay.
So it might be something like when you're running, can you imagine yourself running tall with good posture? What does that feel like? Going to go through those sort of imagery questions, much more technical focus. So swimming, this is how the water is going to feel, or things like that, which can help somebody sort of focus a little bit more on the technical aspect, which will help them move a little bit faster. And then, so that side of things, when you think about it, it's used all the time from an endurance coaching perspective, but we wouldn't necessarily class that as visualization. I talk a lot about coaching for swimming, and to be fair, running, but definitely swimming, is where you speak enough metaphors and crazy suggestions and ideas at the end of the pool, and then eventually, hopefully, the athlete looks at you like the penny has dropped, and you're like, that makes total sense to me. And you kind of sit there staring back at them and you have to say, I've got no idea what makes sense to you, but if that works, then we're going to go with that.
That
That coaching.
resonates so much for me. And little things with my stroke that
Yeah.
it's taken like 3 different coaches, and finally one said something and I was like, oh, that makes sense. Okay,
And
great.
probably when you think about it, the first coach you with probably said exactly the same thing, but going back to my point about not being ready for the athlete to hear it at the right time, it may not have necessarily worked at that time. So coaches use metaphors, imagery all the time to describe how something should feel, what you should be trying to do. If you look at video analysis, what a big part of video analysis is giving that imagery feedback to an athlete, be that can they see what they're doing, or if they're watching other athletes run or watch other athletes do things, they're getting their external visualization, they can see how it should be done. So a lot of the stuff around coaching and endurance coaching, there's a huge amount of imagery in there, aside from that classic, hitting a perfect golf swing or tennis serve, or that normal imagery as we would recognize it. So all the time in terms of coaching, we're delivering cues, technical analysis, biomechanical thoughts, things like that. And then as an athlete gets more tired, the second half of a marathon isn't particularly kind. And if you ask anybody at that point in time, 30 kilometers into a marathon, Laura, run faster. If you're polite, we might get a nice response coming back, but no one can run faster at that point. Like, getting them to run faster is the worst piece of advice that you could possibly give them, because if you're lucky, you might only get a few short words thrown back at you. But in reality, that's going to really put them off. Whereas you could use imagery. So giving them a cue, something to think about, is going to be much more powerful. If you see someone running past you, technical cue to help them run. And it might be that the athlete has a few technical cues that really work or resonate for them, and they're using it as a mantra. You've got your supporters using that and shouting that as a reminder to pull you back into that focus as well. Or it might just be that someone just says something quite positive. It's like, be light on your feet, quick feet here, or don't lean into the hill, or whatever it might be. And that is that cue. There's huge amounts of imagery, but not necessarily in the ways that we necessarily kind of classically see it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And something that's coming to mind for me with this is how important it is for athletes to manage their coaches a bit here and be, I would imagine, but I'm looking for your feedback on this, like quite explicit. It's really important to have that two-way conversation and make sure it's clear what imagery is coming up for the athlete. Does that resonate for you as a coach? And if so, how make sure that things are sinking in for athletes so that it's working for them? Or do you just the proof is in the pudding and you can tell based on their performance or physical response to something, whether it's sinking in?
Yeah, definitely. It's worth knowing how someone, for example, if I'm working with somebody who's coming from more of an engineering or a mathematics background, that that's the kind of brain that they've got based on what they do as a job. The descriptions you're going to give, the way you're going to describe something, is going to be in a way that hopefully they start getting a little bit more out of. On the flip side, if you're working with somebody who is definitely not numerically inclined and more creative, the image that you'd be putting towards them will be very different again. So it is about knowing the athlete, and it is about still using a whole bunch of different things, but again, checking to see that they do really understand how that feels or what that means for them. And it might be going back to the unsurmountable mountain that you're trying to get over, like, can I swim better? Generic open goal which someone has. I want to swim faster. Breaking that skill down into something which is a much more bite-sized chunk and giving them something metaphorical then which they can dial into is also going to really help. So yeah, that bit didn't work. So let's break the skill down further to try and make sure we're helping you do that. Because again, if you think about a lot of the cues you're getting, you're going to end up singularly focusing on one thing. If you play a golf swing or a tennis shot, you're not going to be able to do much more than one thing in that split second of hitting the ball. So you need to try and find what that feel is to be able to kind of hit repeatable shots in the same sort of way. And it's kind of similar with running or swimming or cycling, except you've got a few more iterations, so you can kind of cycle through them a little bit more frequently. But yeah, it's kind of a free practice as well. If you sort of sit there just imagining it, going back to that guy who played golf having never played again for a while, it's a free practice round. If you can get that imagery and you can really dial that in, and you spend a bit more time at the end of the pool, for example, trying to work out what it is that the coach has just said, you're going to nail it, and that's going to be better for you. And you can then kind of feel it going forward the next time, and you can write it down in your training notes, and you can say, right, that's what I want to try and feel. You can then repeat it for the next time again.
That makes sense. So pre-race, big race, a race, it's the one that everyone's trained for that year. What is the one thing that you would encourage? We'll stick with triathlon here to make it specific. If an athlete can only visualize or have imagery about one element of that race, which is the one that you would pick?
Something positive. which is a catch-all. It is like, it has to be something which they can kind of pull back into. So yeah, big race coming up, their A race. The imagery might be more feeling focused. So how are you going to feel as you hit the finish line? I'd want to dial in more specifically to cues and specifics about how they feel for swimming or running or cycling. But ultimately, coming into that, lead into that race, it's like, what's the focal point? It's like, let's keep everything in the positive direction. And, triathletes are fantastic at igniting fear amongst each other. So it's going to be the windiest day ever. It's the hottest day ever. It's going to be really, it's really dangerous conditions in the water or whatever it might be. Triathletes in particular, but most athletes do the same thing. They can ignite and start bringing that crowd mentality where people start just getting more worried about something than they really need to.
Yeah, it goes back to the controllables, right? Well, the current is what it is. So what do I know how to do? Put my head down, power through, and keep a steady stroke.
Absolutely. So what's a visualization of having a steady stroke? That's all you need to focus on. But I think a lot of the time, if you take that one level further, the current's really strong. You're starting to have images of, I won't get to the finish line off the swimming bit. I'll get swept out to sea. There might be some genuine kind of swimming fear things which go on because not everybody's totally comfortable in the waters. All those images are negative. Going back to the first thing we said about imagery and visualization, those negative things are going to be way more powerful than the positive ones. So we want to try and think about those positive things instead. So if it's a really hot race, I'm looking forward to my ice cream at the other end. I'm going to make sure I focus on my ice cream. Whatever works for that individual. So yeah, it has to be positive and it has to be kind of focused beyond what the crowds are all getting worried about.
Makes sense. This has been such an insightful conversation, Philip. Thank you. If you could leave us with one final succinct thought about visualization, or I'll even say about mental training in general, I'll let you pick. What would it be?
So definitely the general one would be make sure you've got all the foundations in. Visualization is really important, but if you're not strong mentally in some of those other areas, then it's going to be very difficult to really capitalize in some of those areas. The other thing is, I guess, from a visualization, is just start dreaming. Like, have that big dream. Start visualizing whatever that big dream is, and then start breaking it down visually and see what you are able to do. Because suddenly, all those, like, can you put your shoes on? Yes, you can. So there's no reason why you can't do whatever that big race is. So I think those are my sort of two. First of all, get your foundations in properly at the beginning, and second of all, look into what those big dreams are and really start dreaming, because you'll be able to.
Hopefully some of those foundations can be facilitated through Mindfuel, but I think this has probably made people quite interested in speaking to you or finding out more about Try Training Harder. So where can people find you on the web?
We are on a few of the social media platforms, but yes, trytrainingharder.com, and you should be able to find out some information there, depending what you're after.
Perfect. Well, as always, link Philip's contact details in the expert section of the website and in this episode description. So follow up with him there and add your comments, your likes, any other questions directly on the episode, and I will funnel those back to Philip if needed as well. Philip, thank you so much. This has really been a fantastic conversation, and I hope that all of you have also benefited and learned a few things. And if you'd like to check out our other content, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and head over to our website at mindfuel.fit to check out the resources there and subscribe to our emails so that you can stay on top of all of the expert advice that's coming out of Mindfuel. Phil, thanks again. Thanks to all of you for joining. Happy and healthy training, and we'll see you next time. Bye.